So hi everyone, welcome again to a new episode of BetaCast. I'm Alison Avila, and in this episode regarding the innovation policy season, in partnership with Google, I have the pleasure of hosting Tim Smith. Tim Smith is Iberian Correspondent for Sifted. Tim, welcome, and thank you for our time for being here with us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Maybe before jumping into our questions, could be interesting to explain for the ones who still don't know what Sifted is, what's its mission. There's so many projects regarding content for the startup and innovation and investment community, but I'm sure Sifted has specific, I would say, value proposition on it. Could we start by this explanation?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sifted is quite a new publication. It was founded back in January 2019. So it's only just over a year old. And in that time, it's gone from having obviously an audience of 0 to, up in the hundreds of thousands of monthly visitors, 300, 400,000, those kind of numbers. And the sort of proposition for starting Sifted was a group of journalists who were working at the Financial Times, seeing that there was a kind of gap in coverage of European startups. So it was obvious that it was Silicon Valley and that there was kind of an absence of serious reporting on an in-depth level. So what you had was a lot of kind of news of funding releases, reactive news to the latest funding rounds, but not a lot looking beyond those headlines. So the idea with Sifted was to try and start a publication that could kind of explain the world for people working in startups rather than just kind of chasing the latest exciting news. So the mission, I suppose, is to both be, a champion of the ecosystem, but also be a critical friend. So try and identify things that are going wrong, but also things that are going right. And my role as Iberian Correspondent, which was a kind of, 6 months ago I was appointed, is to be based in Iberia and try and give some visibility to the startups and the great work that entrepreneurs are doing here. So it's about, often there's a kind of perception in Northern Europe that those are the place where of course, Portugal and Spain have got some brilliant success stories and a lot of success stories coming through the pipeline. So yeah, my job is to try and find those stories and to tell Iberia, but also the rest of Europe about them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, considering this, not only this period of experience as an Iberian correspondent, but probably also regarding our past experiences, we are now in a season dedicated to innovation policies, and it's very common. It's pretty usual to hear from startup community or even from corporates or investors that depending on the case, you don't need to pay that much attention to public policies or public regulation to make things happen. Considering your experience for this period, how would you frame this? I mean, have you felt the impact of any government measures or new policies over time that could change the route of what has been done in this market? Or it's a truly open and less regulated than should be? I don't know your opinion on this.
Yeah, I think, it's worth saying that my experience is, I've been a journalist for a long time, but only covering tech as a specific beat for a relatively short period of time. But that said, I worked at the BBC World Service for quite a while. So I was quite involved in kind of looking at European policy and things. And I think people in the innovation world can be quite quick to dismiss regulation. But I think it's also worth noting that some European regulation has been a real success story. If you look at GDPR, when I was working at the BBC, that was a massive headache in terms of the way we dealt with people's data on a kind of organizational level. It really kind of created a lot of obstacles and challenges for the way things were done. But I think when we look back, we can realize that actually that was a really important piece of regulation in terms of empowering the consumer and making people's data more secure. And I don't think anyone would seriously want to go back on that now. And then, you know, another good example perhaps is PSD2, the second iteration of the Payment Services Directive. That's an example of regulation, but that has led to an explosion in open banking. Open banking and fintech APIs are now, you know, an incredibly powerful tool of financial inclusion in the EU. So I understand that for innovators and founders, regulation, and particularly shifting regulation, can cause a lot of headaches, and it can lead people to sort of withdraw and say, okay, we're just going to do our thing because the regulations will change in a month. So I think my general thesis is that regulation is important, but what people really need is clarity, and that's kind of what the EU should work on, in my view.
You would say so that this is the reason why sometimes it's so hard to engage with this community, or for this community to engage with this kind of discussions, because there's a lot of regulatory topics around this community right now, not to mention the ones you already said. We are right now talking at European level on artificial intelligence regulation, blockchain, data access, privacy, online platforms, copyright. We already had this discussion. This is so important to any digital related business. And for sure, in the end, it may have an impact on any ongoing business. Would you say that the way politicians used to approach or to open the discussion with the community, with the society in general, that's the reason why it's so hard to have this connection, this ongoing engagement?
I see what you mean. And, you know, artificial intelligence is a good example. There was a white paper published in February about the EU's kind of plan for how to regulate AI. I think everyone can agree that it's an area where some kind of controls over the way AI is developed are really important, and not just for kind of, you know, general security, but also for people's trust in how AI is used. And that's going to be crucial for startups working with artificial intelligence, that people trust that this is being done responsibly. But one problem with the regulation or the white paper as proposed is the way that high risk and low risk categories are defined. So again, it's, you know, it's a question of clarity. And I see what you mean in terms of the lack of approachability. And I suppose I hope in some way that new instruments like the European Innovation Council, which are bringing established entrepreneurs, you know, one example is a really brilliant woman called Ana Maiquez, who founded Neuroelectrics in Spain, which is a big, successful biotech company. She's one of the members of the board of the European Innovation Council. So I think that's an exciting measure, and hopefully it's something that can bring entrepreneurs closer to the decision-making process, perhaps, in terms of, you know, having the conversations with regulators, because it does seem that there is a kind of distance.
Probably you already brought the key word here, which is clarity. Do you used to tackle with this kind of explanation while writing, while working as a journalist? Do you see this difficulty while engaging or having this conversation with the community to explain this, or to figure out if they understand these proposals?
So what the question is, do founders understand the regulations, or?
We can frame this way, yeah.
I mean, I think it's kind of as you describe, in that, you know, founders have to work with what they're given, right? And we have at the moment with artificial intelligence quite a vague set of understandings. And I can totally sympathize with why, if you're working in artificial intelligence, that leaves you in a kind of no man's land and is no good really for trying to kind of keep up with the US and China in terms of artificial intelligence innovation. But, I think it comes down to this sense that there has to be a good dialogue. And, if you look at there are examples where there is a good dialogue between policymakers in the European Commission and startups. One example is Hyperloop. So this is an exciting technology which has the power to massively reduce the carbon footprint of short-term travel around Europe. And as I understand it, from speaking with one Spanish Hyperloop company based in Valencia, there are, very regular meetings with the European Commission, preparing the groundwork, proactive regulation. So I think there are examples where it can work, but there are also, as we've discussed, areas where a lot more clarity could be introduced. And I think Europe kind of sees its role in this as being the adult in the conversation, right? So, if you have the Wild West of Silicon Valley, innovating, constantly doing things, but not necessarily thinking about the implications, you then have China and Asia who sort of have their own agenda and aren't necessarily concerned about issues like intellectual property, and it's its own kind of Wild West. Then you have Europe in the middle, which has its role of kind of sitting back and being like, okay, we want to do this technology responsibly. So I don't think European entrepreneurs should be necessarily against that. Hopefully it will create a strong position in the future, because these regulations often become blueprints for other parts of the world. So whilst it might be not racing ahead originally, perhaps it's a kind of tortoise in the hare scenario that, eventually you win by doing things.
I guess I just lose you for a moment, but I'm afraid I've got your point. But so in the end, Tim, for you, all these concerns in Europe regarding regulation would be in the end a competitive advantage for this ecosystem when compared with America or Asia, just as you said, because now usually you can have the feeling like we might be losing competitiveness, but this should be a future-looking or future-oriented discussion. In your opinion, just considering what you said, this should be framed as an advantage for Europe.
Well, I understand that, founders who are working, this AI one is a good example, because there isn't the clarity that there should be in the white paper document, right? So I'm not saying that gives us a competitive advantage as a continent. But I think if you look at regulations like GDPR and PSD2, payments and data security, those are good examples of why regulation can be a positive thing and why it can lead to enforcement and trust between users and founders. So yes, I understand that over-regulation can hamper innovation, but I think there is some kind of value to be had in doing things the right way.
Perfect. Yeah, personally speaking, if you permit me, I agree with your position. But let me ask you something just to go to move further. We just went through different topics. We were talking about artificial intelligence, but also quoted or nominated blockchain, data access, privacy, the Digital Service Act. In your opinion, can we point out which one is the most important or the most urgent one to be organized or regulated in Europe?
Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of why I've been talking about artificial intelligence. I think artificial intelligence is probably the most key area at the moment, because it kind of permeates everything. So it's pretty much that is
ubiquitous.
Yeah, so I think getting that right is going to be crucial. And it's very important that innovative, exciting companies aren't hamstrung by these, at the moment, quite vague set of rules.
Well, just to move forward, Tim, as you said, you work at SIFT that is focused on the Iberian market. So obviously you are talking mainly about Portugal and Spain. Could you highlight some singular feature characteristic from these countries when compared with the rest of Europe or between the two countries?
Yeah, I think, one sort of surface level thing, but very important thing for founders and companies that might relocate to these places is that there are two things that are true in the Spanish and Portuguese ecosystems. One is that there is access to good quality talent, and that has happened by a development of these ecosystems over the last 10 years. And also that you can tend to have a much lower burn rate if you're in these countries. So if you're a startup used to paying rents in Berlin, Amsterdam, if you move to one of these cities in Portugal or Spain, you can massively reduce your costs. And that's a very, appealing thing for people who might want to set up a business here. That's also not to mention the high quality of education. Portugal, particularly, a lot of people have spoken to me about the quality of artificial intelligence profiles there. So you've got a situation where in the past, maybe these highly talented people might have left in their own country, and that's creating a very positive situation for these ecosystems. There are obviously problems. I think both countries would say that in terms of the amount of funding available within their own countries, it's small if you compare it to the UK, Germany, France, and that often they'll have to go abroad to look for money. But I think that is changing. And, we keep seeing, particularly in Spain, the announcement of new funds and international funds also moving into Spain. So it's not just the fact that there's more money coming from within the country, but also international funds are realizing the value of placing offices here to be closer to what they see as good deals. And that's another feature as well that I think covers both. Outsiders view Spain and Portugal as places to find, I don't want to say, cheap, but they think there are propositions here that represent better value than they see in the deal flow back in London, for instance, that valuations here are perhaps just less inflated. They're a bit more natural. There's a chance that in London, some startups valuations are just way too high. But I think it's true that investors see there's a lot of opportunity, and, you're seeing that in a lot of new success stories. So I think perhaps another issue is that there's still a kind of confidence deficit in that people have been used to being behind the Northern European countries, and that is still the case. But I think, perhaps Portugal and Spain should focus on their strengths a bit. And one of those is the natural bridge between Latin America, and that's particularly evident with fintech startups. So you have big kind of fintechs like the German N26 opening offices in Barcelona, using that as a launch pad to get into Latin America. Same with ID Finance, a Russian founded company. So I think looking at those strengths and the ability of Spanish companies to go global into that quite underserved market is one thing that is really exciting for the ecosystem at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tim. Considering that our focus here, it's more about innovation policies, would you feel able to highlight any particular case of good or bad example on public policies for innovation in Portugal and Spain? And then, as a second part of the question, in the rest of Europe, could you share in your particular approach or understanding best or worst examples of policy making to support digital innovation in these countries?
Sure. Okay. So on a kind of a national level here in Spain, one policy which I personally think is very bad is the way that freelancers are dealt with by the government system. So people just leave Spain if they're a freelancer and trying to set up their own operation, because there's a very punitive, flat tax system where you pay, upwards of 200 euros a month not based on what you're earning, just as a flat fee. So if you're someone who's maybe setting up a digital service just on their own, or is trying to market their skills as a freelancer, or trying to just make it as an entrepreneur, it's an incredibly unattractive place to do that. I come from the UK, where being a freelancer costs you nothing, and it encourages people to work for themselves and be innovative. And, you know, I was a freelancer back there, and it was much, much cheaper. So I think, you know, Spain has a big problem with youth unemployment. And one way of fixing that would be to say, go and start your own things, work for yourself. Don't go and work for a big corporate. Don't go for the secure way. But unfortunately, they make that so difficult. So I think that's a good example of a way that, you know, public policy of, you know, you have to pay your social security could just be better done. And it's kind of punishing the wrong people at the wrong level, I would say. So that would be one bad example.
This is interesting, especially because it's pretty common to listen to people like, okay, entrepreneurship may be the result of the consequence of a lack of opportunities, but you can also see this as, okay, this is just the new way things are. So this is not only about a regular job. You must create your own. So I perfectly see your point. Recently, you also probably you are going to share some more before I jump to my next question. It was related to this one. I don't know if you'd like to highlight some other good or bad example coming for Portugal or Spain, or on the second level from any other European country.
Yeah, okay, so a good example perhaps, and I think one area that Spain has a bit of envy over Portugal is the government-funded joint investment scheme. So if a private investment is made, it will be publicly matched by the Portuguese state. So that's a great example of, you know, the public sphere supporting private investment and encouraging it. So, you know, I think that's been a massively successful thing, and something that when I speak to investors here in Spain, they would love to have something like that in their territory. So that's a good example of just putting your money where your mouth is, I think.
You have been covering other developments since the beginning of the pandemic. In your case, we focus on Portugal and Spain. And you have written some articles about the government measures, the announcements, and then recently Sifted published an article written by two entrepreneurs criticizing the lack of agility from the Portuguese government to implement these measures. What about the feedback? You have shared this story, and also you pointed out that the Portuguese support is like a shit. Is like the kind of the way you Sifted has framed this article. How it was the feedback, the moment after this publication? Did you have any additional comments or further quotes on that?
Yeah, so I mean, look, we covered the Portuguese government startup in two ways. We gave the Portuguese government a chance to explain what they were doing as the thing was announced, which I think, you know, no one in Portugal would say wasn't a positive way of kind of announcing that. We gave the government the chance to explain what they were doing, why they thought it was important.
Sure.
And then later on, I started, you know, hearing from, but, you know, on the other hand, we weren't given the chance to challenge the Portuguese government on what they'd done. We were able to ask questions in advance and then publish the news as it came out. I wasn't able to go through the measures and then ask counter questions. So there is, whilst it's important to, you know, announce the good news that there's money available, I was then starting to hear things from founders in Portugal that, okay, maybe this is a bit shit. Like, and to be honest, I wasn't the one who did the newsletter headline of using the poo emoji, but I think what we were trying to reflect was that there is a kind of feeling in Portugal amongst some founders that 25 million is not going to go very far. And in terms of feedback, I mean, we did have some people kind of criticizing their view, but I think it opened up a healthy debate about kind of what the limits of Portugal's role should be and kind of what the restrictions are on Portugal. You know, Spain and Portugal are not Germany and France. They haven't got billions to pour into the startup scheme. And I think everyone realizes in Southern Europe that this is a key time for the European Union to start acting with unity. So what we don't want to see is what happened with Southern Europe after the last crisis, the financial crisis, where they were essentially hung out to dry. So I think conversations about mutual debt, corona bonds as they've been styled, will be really important as we try and understand how the European community actually works, because it's going to be a testing time in terms of unity.
I think you brought an interesting hook regarding the new long-term budget proposition from the European Union. And we were talking right about this, your analysis, your opinion, if this is future-oriented enough, or if it's really considering key issues for the next steps in society and business, not only regarding technology, but the startups' role within it. So I would like to have your analysis on this, because we know that
Sure.
It seems that the European Union is trying to face this crisis differently from 10 years ago. It's a different approach for sure, but this doesn't mean that this new budget, it's really facing the key topics to be tackled.
Sure. So I don't know if you heard any of my last answer, but I was talking about my optimism around the European Innovation Council and the new Horizon iteration that comes after Horizon 2020. So, you know, there isn't unlimited money available for innovation. The EU is always going to have to balance different sectors, and we have to remember that if you don't work in entrepreneurialism or startups, the fact that so many of these companies don't actually make any money yet is a bit of a, you know, an eyebrow raiser. So it's not that technology and innovation is the only thing they focus on. But I think if you look at those two instruments, and particularly actually if you look at how Horizon 2020 has been such a success, I can tell you, coming from the UK and looking ahead at Brexit, innovators are devastated that they won't have access to that potential money anymore. So that's a great example of how the European Union has directed money in the right way. And I'm very hopeful that the European Innovation Council has this stated aim of looking at technologies that will be transformative in positive ways, health tech, green tech, fintech, in ways that can genuinely change people's lives for the better. So I think that personally, that instrument in itself is probably the perfect way to leverage European funding in the right place. So I'm optimistic about that.
You came up with an interesting point, which is Brexit. Were you there? If I understood well, you were there during the whole process, and in a way you felt part of the pain, not only for the technology community for sure, but from so many areas regarding these changes. It's interesting that in a parallel way, you also brought a consequence of policy making, not only for innovation, for the entire economy. How has been, for sure you still have your contacts and your own connections there. Could you share a bit with us about this afterwards, let's say, or not necessarily afterwards moment regarding Brexit? What about the feeling when you see that, okay, it's confirmed that it's supposed to finish all the agreements until the end of this year? What about the spirits there?
Yeah, I mean, it depends who you ask, right? But you know, I'll put myself out there and say that I was very heavily pro-Remain, and that was one of my reasons for moving to Spain, was that I wanted to enjoy the freedom of movement while that was still simple. But yeah, I think while in a way there's satisfaction that at least we know we're leaving now. For a lot of time, there was all of this ridiculous kind of parliamentary political kind of, you know, questioning of, can it be stopped? Can we have a second referendum? And whilst we have clarity that yes, we know it's happening, we still don't know what kind of Brexit we're going to get. And I think in terms of a kind of a business community perspective, one thing that people are worried about in some sectors is that this current Conservative government and their sort of seemingly comfortable position on having a hard Brexit are really, the only kind of economic position that's available to them with a hard Brexit and having more barriers with Europe is essentially becoming like a European Singapore, low tax, low regulation, open for business. That seems to be the direction of travel. So, we'll have to wait and see whether that encourages innovation in Britain. Britain does have a very strong tech ecosystem, which, to be honest, seems to be resilient to a degree at the moment. I suppose that's partly to do with language and, the financial hub there and access to cash. But yeah, I mean, it's remains to be seen, I suppose. I think spirits, everyone was kind of thinking, God, we've got Brexit done, and then this crisis started. So it's been on the back burner for a lot of people's minds at the moment. But there's definitely a lot of fear that, we're looking at a recession and economic downturn following COVID-19. And if that is compounded by a hard Brexit, which all predictions were saying would bring about a downturn in itself, that could be potentially quite a lot of pain for Britain. So we'll have to see what kind of deal we made.
Yeah, for sure we could go over this, keep discussing this topic for a long time. But just to finish our conversation for now, I'd like to ask you about investment. I know that sifted used to cover a lot, just as you explained in the beginning, not only chasing the headline or the hot news, but also explaining and making it understandable for people. I'd like to ask you, Tim, if you have felt a very tangible change on the pace of investments or the type of investments after the beginning of the pandemic. Could we say that the investment process or the news itself, are they more focused on some specific topics? Do we have new KPIs or features to be considered before deciding investment in this very moment?
Yeah, so, I think when the crisis started, the big kind of concern for startups were that, if you just raise money, lucky you, but if you were thinking about raising money in the next 3 months, then you're in trouble because money is going to be harder to get hold of. And of course, that is true to a degree, because I think when you speak to investors, their general position is that we are looking after our portfolio companies at the moment. That is what we're doing. We're fighting fires, trying to do damage limitation. So just a lot of their bandwidth is taken up doing that. That said, I've been covering funding rounds. There is still money going into startups, but I think what you'll see now is that what investors tell me is that it's going to be like the top tail of the companies, the most kind of hype, the most promising ones, where, you're going to see a few less kind of speculative bets on more outside chances, that it's going to be investment will be doubled down on those companies that are genuinely seen as like promising bets, rather than the slightly more risky, oh, this could be a good idea, we'll have a go on it. So I think that's what will happen with investment, based on my conversations with investors, is that the end of the tail and those slightly more out there ideas are going to find it harder to raise money. But, there is still money out there. Family offices, funds of funds, they still see venture capital as, a lucrative, high risk asset class. And, everyone wants to be the person who backs the company that is the next kind of winner out of this. There were some brilliant success stories out of the last crisis, Airbnb for one. And, there is opportunity when there's downturn, and it's just about, being spotted and making yourself kind of making the case that you can be one of those companies that can really kind of bring us out of this in a positive way. So I think that's what will happen.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because you were talking more about the approach or the thesis regarding investment, and not necessarily about industries, because maybe you could say that the more obvious area for investment would be health tech or fintech, but wouldn't you frame this way? It's less about the industry and more about the thesis, the approach, more risky, more results in the end. in your opinion, it's more about this than the areas?
I mean, there are definitely kind of, sectors that stand to do better out of this. I'm currently researching a piece on B2B SaaS startups, right? So there's kind of, there's a big opportunity as more companies digitize more as we come out of this crisis, that these digital tools that improve efficiency for businesses will become massively more valuable in the new working world. So those kind of B2B SaaS stock prices are going up and up. But on the other side of that, you can't just generalize. Like Unbabel, a Portuguese company who I've been speaking to recently, they had to cut growth forecasts from 150% this year to 50%. And that's because they work with a lot of travel companies. Travel companies are screwed. So, it's not just that if you're in B2B SaaS, you're happy. It's because these companies all depend on a variety of different sectors. But yeah, I think if you look at kind of other things that can do well within that, HR tech is definitely one, and cloud-based solutions as work from home becomes more normal. So you can definitely identify areas that are kind of, obvious. You just have to think about the way the working world has changed. And, cloud-based software is a perfect example that people are going to have to move professional databases and whole computer management systems perhaps into ways that people can be distributed in different locations. Like that's just something we know. And therefore you can see why cloud computing startups are going to do well. Same with kind of HR, I think, mental health startups will be a big thing. Property is another one. The property market has been incredibly disrupted by this, and traditional estate agencies are looking like they're in trouble. A lot have shut down in Spain, I know. So you have a couple of PropTech companies like Housify that stand to perhaps, really be able to disrupt that quite old-fashioned system. Like people will always still need to move house. That's a crisis often leads to outdated models being left by the wayside and becoming obsolete. So I think there is an element. Are we still online here, Alison?
Yeah. We just had a flickering in the end, but I totally got your point, especially because it's a good way to close our conversation, because you're just explaining and giving a very tangible example on how everything is interconnected or interrelated. We can frame one area apart from any other, especially when I talk about technology. So Tim, I really want to thank you for your time. I know you could go through all these topics for hours and hours, but life moves on. I want to thank you for your availability. This is BetaCast on innovation policies season in partnership with Google for this particular one. If you like, you can subscribe or the channel, you can share, you can like or recommend these programs. This was Tim Smith from Sifted / Financial Times. Thank you so much for your time, and see you the next round.
All right. Thanks a lot, Alison.
Thank you, Tim.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you all. See you soon.
Okay. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.